and it showed that it was poll of the population, not the dictators, and it showed that indeed there were some of them did fear Iran at 10%. In contrast, 77% regarded the U.S. as the major threat to the region, and 88% regarded Israel as the major threat. In fact, antagonism to U.S. policy was so extreme that a majority, 57%, thought the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. Well, those polls I don't think were even reported in the United States. They certainly were not mentioned in all of the excited reporting about how the Arabs support our attitude toward Iran. And it's the guiding principle again. As long as the dictators support us, or we think they do, and as long as not much is happening, everything is fine. It's quite striking that this was accepted, kind of expected in the diplomatic service and the State Department, but it was also in media reporting and public commentary, pretty much across the spectrum, liberal commentators too, as far as I could tell. And again, the polls I don't think were even reported. Perhaps the most serious case of all of these is Pakistan. It's no big secret that the population in Pakistan is now stridently and radically anti-American. Huge percentage. It's been increasing over the years. The WikiLeaks cables have interesting material about that. They reveal that the Ambassador Patterson, has been regularly informing Washington that by expanding the Afghan war into Pakistan, as we've been doing, and by pressing the Pakistani army to attack the tribal areas, and by drone attacks, and so on, all of this is inflaming public opinion even further. It's also strengthening the radical Islamists, who are now a very serious threat to the country. It's even raising the threat that Pakistan's nuclear weapons, huge supply of nuclear weapons, which incidentally were built with the help of the Reagan administration, it's raising the fear that these might fall into the hands of the radical Islamists. I mean, that's the ultimate nightmare, but we must continue. We can continue on the present course, keeping to the guiding principles and facing the consequences, fomenting terror, crashing our own economy, inspiring hatred among oppressed populations that sooner or later are likely to explode, as is happening right now before our eyes, and with consequences that could be very severe. Quite severe in Egypt, but in Pakistan, extremely severe, and elsewhere too. But if we decide to pursue this course, we should at least do it with eyes open. Well, let me turn to the domestic scene. Throughout American history, there has been a constant struggle over who should control and who should obey. The Founding Fathers were quite ambivalent about democracy, even democracy for the narrow sector of people who they felt should participate, namely free men, no women, no slaves. It's worth remembering that the first revolution in the hemisphere that brought about a society of free men, not women, but free men, was in 1804 in Haiti. One of the reasons why Haiti was so feared and repressed by the United States, which was terrified that this might spread. Same with Europe, and still is up to the present moment. But not here. Here it was supposedly democracy for free men and a limited democracy. James Madison, who was the main framer of the Constitution, as you know, he was concerned that if voters could determine policy, then the majority would challenge privilege. and they would insist on policies in the interests of the large majority of the population. And that's unacceptable. So he therefore framed the constitutional order so that power should be in the hands of the Senate. That's the way it was set up under the Constitution. The executive was an administrator. Power was in the hands of the Senate. The Senate, according to Madison, as he explained in the debates of the Constitutional Convention, he said the Senate represents the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men who have respect for property owners and their rights and understand that the primary task of the government, I'm quoting him, is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Well, in order to ensure this outcome, the Senate was given the most power, and senators were given 6-year terms, and they were elected by legislatures, so they'd be under control. Remember, it wasn't until a century later, under the 17th Amendment, more than a century, that under very substantial popular pressure, direct election of senators was established. That's what the 17th Amendment is. And now, quite interestingly, the far-right supporters of unhindered corporate power are talking about rescinding the 17th Amendment. So we'll put power back where it belongs, in the hands of property and their rights, people who know how to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Madison, to his credit, very quickly perceived that the system that he had established was seriously undermining his own principles of justice and freedom. Just a couple of years later, in 1792, he lamented, I'm quoting him, about the daring depravity of the times as the stock jobbers, that's our Wall Street, are becoming the tools and tyrant of government, bribed by its largesses and overawing it by clamors and combinations. He could be describing what's happening right now. The words apply quite precisely. A little less literary flair, but exactly right. The struggle for popular democracy continued after the Constitution. It's always been, particularly through the century, the 19th century and on, it's always been the labor movement which was at the forefront, and it's been a core element. We might remember that, or discover if we don't know it already, that in the mid-19th century, American workers regarded wage labor as essentially the same as chattel slavery, differing only in that it was temporary. That was the banner under which Northern workers fought the Civil War: eliminate all slavery, chattel slavery and wage labor. In fact, that was such a popular idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. There was at the time a very lively free press. Actually, that's the period of the most exuberant and lively free press in American history. It included a labor press, which was written and produced by workers in factories, many of them women from the farms who were called factory girls. They condemned what they called the new spirit of the age. This is 1850. The new spirit of the age: gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Sound familiar? And the reduction of working people to, I'm quoting it now, to a state of servitude under the domination of a moneyed aristocracy hanging over us like a mighty avalanche, threatening annihilation to every man who dares to question their right to enslave and oppress the poor and unfortunate, the owners and managers. The labor press also condemned what it called the bought priesthood of the media, the universities, the intellectual class, apologists for power who sought to justify the despotism that was strengthening its grip and demeaning the demeaning values that it upheld. They also held, quoting again, that those who work in the mills should own them. Now, these are ideas that became the rallying cry of the organized labor movement in the late 19th century, including its more conservative elements, and have a lot of significance for today. Right now, the government corporate alliance, as you're aware, is closing plants that could be converted to production of things that the country badly needs, like, for example, high-speed rail or green technology. But for that to happen, it would be necessary to recover the democratic spirit of working people of the 19th century, which was renewed in the 1930s with very significant effects, battered by bitter class war since then. Well, it actually, if you look back over the history, it was no small task to drive these ideas out of people's heads, probably not very far below the surface, and also to beat down the democratizing forces of the labor movement. The United States, for all kinds of historical reasons, happens to have an unusually class-conscious business class. And not by accident, we also happen to have a very violent labor history. Hundreds of American workers were being killed by security forces in labor actions well into the late 1930s. And nothing similar had been taking place in Europe throughout the century. In Europe, also, unions were far more solidly established, along with parliamentary labor parties. That disparity is once again quite great, much to the detriment of American society, in my opinion. Well, despite the reliance on violence, by the time of the First World War, the business classes were coming to realize that so much freedom had been won by popular struggle that it was becoming impossible to control the public by force. They recognized around the First World War that new means had to be devised in order to control the public, to maintain that guiding principle. And the new means that they devised were control of opinion and attitudes and diversion of the population away from the political arena. This is all very self-conscious, incidentally. Read all about it in the business press. That's when the public relations industry, now a huge industry, that's when it began to develop in the two freest societies in the world, Britain and the United States, where the problem was greatest. The goals were very explicit. Read some of them. The goals were to engineer consent of the masses so that the intelligent minority could rule without disturbance by ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, that is, the population. Their role is to be spectators, not participants in action. These outsiders must be fed necessary illusions and emotionally potent oversimplifications in order to keep them under control. Actually, I'm not quoting from the right. These are leading progressive intellectuals, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, liberals, Edward Bernays, who was one of the founders of the public relations industry, Walter Lippmann, who was the most prominent public intellectual of the 20th century, the distinguished moralist Reinhold Niebuhr, who's called the theologian of the liberal establishment, incidentally Obama's favorite philosopher, he's told us. If you move over, elite opinion was similar across the spectrum, and it gets naturally much harsher as you move to the right. And the similarity to the debates in the Constitutional Convention is quite evident. Also the similarity to the Muashar doctrine that the U.S. is applying in the dictatorships that it supports. Well, the business press